So today we'll be talking about the relationship between quality of life and standard of living. The core idea for today is understanding how to measure the success of a civilization. How can we tell whether or not a civilization is doing well? Right now, the main metric that's used in industrial civilizations to measure the success of a civilization is GDP, gross domestic product, which is the output of goods and services produced by labor and property located in a given country. Ultimately, it measures how much stuff we have, how much stuff we make, and how much stuff we use. But is that the right way to measure success? Instead, should well-being and quality of life be brought to bear? And this is something that Professor Nardi has talked quite a bit over the course of this quarter. In our opinion, quality of life is not equal to standard of living. This is a more slight mathematical way of saying you can't buy happiness, essentially. That standard of living is based on stuff, whereas quality of life is based on well-being. And I'd like to give an example of the distinction. So one thing that people have an innate desire for is social belonging, so essentially having friends. And the companies might have you believe that if you buy these fancy jeans, then you will have more friends. This is a process called manufacturing desire, that you're hooking up the desire for a product to the desire for a basic need like social belonging. And I would suggest that the desire for the fancy jeans is an aspect of standard of living, whereas the desire for friends is an aspect of quality of life. So the standard of living is an indirect measure of quality of life, whereas the direct measure, quality of life itself, might be a more appropriate way to go about measuring the success of a civilization, the quality of life of its populace. Arguably, though, it's a little bit harder to measure than standard of living. Standard of living, since it deals with resources, it's inherently resource intensive. That allows it to be a little bit easier to measure, but it also ends up causing it to be more intensive in terms of the resources that it uses. The interesting thing about quality of life is that it doesn't necessarily need to be resource intensive. Here's an interesting chart that shows the relationship essentially between quality of life. It's a graph between economic happiness versus gross domestic product. And it shows that at low levels, they are fairly well correlated, but that it maxes out at a certain point. That essentially, if you have a population that doesn't have enough resources to have food, that population will have a low quality of life. But that once you get above a certain point, adding more resources doesn't necessarily improve quality of life dramatically. And there are various different researchers who suggest that the plateau point comes at the equivalent of $36,000 or $75,000. But the core principle is that above a certain point, it doesn't necessarily make your life better to have more stuff. So in this course, we're in favor of focusing on basic needs, looking at well-being and basic needs rather than necessarily gross domestic product. And not just well-being for humans, but also well-being for various different species. We share the planet with lots and lots of different animals and plants and other organisms. And to whatever extent we can, trying to bring the well-being of all of these different species to bear. Thank you very much.